Hello, welcome to my Wednesday talk. So this is lesson 6. In the notes, this would be Roman numeral 2, the invasion from the south and the collapse of German resistance in France. So, it's a little windy out here, but I think the sound will be okay. Well, when we were talking on Monday, I talked about the fact that the landings took place. Some of them were questionable for a while, but they all made it through. And that the beachheads were secure. Hitler had failed to get rid of them. And so this has opened up basically what we would call the third front. The Germans are now being squeezed by the Russians from the east, by the Allies coming up from the south in Italy, and now also from the west, the landings in France. But they're kind of trapped in the northwestern France area, partly by the Germans, partly by geography. The terrain in this part of France is known as hedgerow terrain. These farmers' fields have been growing for about 900 or 1,000 years. And so the hedgerows built around them each had a trench, a ditch, and then a hilltop. And that hilltop was covered with thick foliage, pretty impenetrable. You couldn't drive a tank through it. It would bottom out the tank, and even when they finally figured it out, the problem was the tanks came up over the hedgerow because it was in a ditch. They came up over the hedgerow and immediately presented their bottoms to the Germans, who blew the tank up by firing into the bottom of the tank until the tank had got so far up the hedgerow that it tipped over and came down the other side. For the soldiers, it took them a couple of weeks to figure out how to capture a field based on how, and the Germans had 4 years to lay out all their fighting positions and bunkers and prearrange artillery fire on every one of these fields. So just crawling into the field and getting up and running across the field was suicidal. And it took a while for them to figure out the correct way to capture this type of terrain. Anyway, July and August 1944 are the period known as the Breakout. And once they figured out how to bust through the German lines in the bocage, the French call it, or the hedgerow country as we call it, then they were able to break out behind the Germans, and the Germans didn't really have a plan for that. Well, they knew once the Allies broke out, they wouldn't be able to contain them. They just didn't have the same resources. The Allies were landing thousands of soldiers, thousands of vehicles every day. The day after D-Day, my wife's uncle landed with his artillery unit, and this is how close the enemy still was to the beach. When the artillery unit landed, they had trucks and they were towing cannons behind them. They got off the ships and drove across the beach and up onto the hill above the beach, and they immediately unloaded, spun the guns around, and started firing. So they could see the beach behind them, and they could see France in front of them. So, I mean, the front line was close. And her uncle, Lieutenant Norp, lost his company commander and most of his officers in that fighting around the Bocage country in Normandy, to the point where by the time the breakouts happened at the end of August, he was a second lieutenant, and he was in charge of his battery because the captain and the first lieutenant were dead. And he was the ranking guy. That was probably 20, 21. And he himself was wounded. That was his first time getting wounded, but they patched him up and sent him right back in. And he lived with that shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life. So the breakout came, and one of the breakouts, the British version was called Operation Goodwood, led by General Montgomery, and that was the breakout into the city of Caen and into northeastern France, headed for Paris. For the Americans, it was called Operation Cobra. And the first part of it went horribly wrong. The bombers came over and blew the German positions to pieces until they realized, oopsie, those were the American positions. Oops. Several hundred Americans were killed. When the smoke cleared, they moved forward anyway, even though they'd suffered all these casualties, because the Germans had been blown up as well. And they were able to break out. And at that point, General Patton came back over and was able to take command of a whole new organization. So General Patton was finally back in a real fight, in a real war, and he was actually in command of the Third Army, it was called. He was the Third Army commander. Anyway, so, oh, my daughter's here. Hi. I'm making a video. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so at the same time the breakout's happening, the other thing you need to know is there's a whole nother invasion, and almost nobody talks about it. But they had a second invasion of the southern part of France in the Mediterranean. They invaded from the Mediterranean Sea into the south coast of France, like around Bordeaux, and started invading north. And what this meant was the Germans really couldn't fall back anywhere in France and create a new line because the Allies were already behind them. And because of that, they just decided to evacuate France. And the German troops pulled out rapidly, so fast, actually, out of France, that one of the German commanders joked that the reason the Allies haven't destroyed us is because we're retreating faster than they could advance. And he was kind of right. The biggest problem they had in those last days of August was running out of gas for the Allies, running out of gas. So they wanted to run the Germans over, they just didn't have any gas in their gas tanks, so it became a logistical problem. Anyway, these two forces came together, and Paris was liberated. Charles de Gaulle and the Free French Army suddenly have France back. Charles de Gaulle becomes the military and the political leader. All of the Vichy French are rounded up and arrested. Marshal Pétain, who was the Vichy president, is thrown in prison. And vengeance is carried out all over France for anybody who was nice to the Germans. It's a very French thing. And so as they push towards the border with Germany, they also pushed north into Belgium. And they liberated a large chunk of Belgium and started heading for Holland. They really wanted to free the Dutch. It's about this time that Anne Frank is taken away. She had survived in Amsterdam all the way up to, the fall of 1944. And it wasn't until the fall that someone turned in her family and she was arrested and taken away. As I said, the Germans treated the Dutch very badly. So, Field Marshal Montgomery came up with an excellent plan in his own mind. Everybody else thought it was ridiculous, and it ended up being ridiculous, where he would get the 3 airborne divisions, the 82nd, the 101st, and the British 1st Airborne, to land capturing bridges across the Rhine River into Germany. And then war would be over by Christmas. Well, whenever you hear somebody say that, just know that it's probably going to fail. It was called Operation Market Garden, and it happened in October, late fall, and it didn't work. The idea was the paratroopers would land, capture the bridges on a single road, and then an armored column of tanks would charge down the road, linking them up, connecting the dots, and free Holland from the Germans. Well, they managed to get the first 2 bridges, but it took so much time, and the Germans were on to what was happening. And so instead they surrounded the British 1st Parachute Division at Arnhem in Holland and just chewed it to pieces. The survivors only escaped by swimming across the Rhine River or crossing in small boats in the middle of the night. And the British 1st Parachute Division basically ceased to exist. And then a very sad note on top of that, the Polish Airborne Regiment, which had been training all this time since they escaped Poland, parachuted in the middle of the day into drop zones that they thought were friendly but were actually controlled by the Germans, and they also got chewed to pieces. So that ended badly for the Poles as well. There's an excellent movie about this called A Bridge Too Far, and it's also an excellent book if you're looking for something to read. Cornelius Ryan's the author. And by late fall, the situation in Europe is that they have come up against the Gustav Line, not the Gustav Line, the Siegfried Line, which is a set of border fortifications in Germany. They've come up against the German border. They've only managed to capture one town in Germany. I think it's Aachen. But it's been some severe fighting, and things start to settle down as the weather gets colder and the snow starts falling and Thanksgiving happens. The Allied troops actually get a hot Thanksgiving meal all up and down the front line. Turkey leg, stuffing, mashed potatoes. Pretty crazy. The Germans don't get anything like that. But the Germans are now fighting for Germany, so they're going to fight very hard. And the Allies believe that the war is probably going to be over within a few months. In the beginning of December 1944, they're not wrong. We've got the rest of December, then we got January, February, March, April, May. The war has still got 5 months. And unfortunately for the Allies, the Germans still have one big fight left in them, and that's called the Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans will counterattack on December 16th, 1944. But that's a story for next week. So that's my video for today. I hope you all have a peaceful and safe week. Bye.